Good morning again, everybody. Just to be sure that you're at the right program, my name is Laibl Wolf, okay? I'm going to be speaking at this session how to change one's habitual pathways of mind and emotion. My next session at 2 o'clock will deal more specifically with mindfulness and using meditative techniques. So those of you who now realize you've come absolutely to the wrong lecture, this is a great time to get up and leave. It's wonderful how Hashem arranges the development of technology in such a way that we're able to cope with the exigencies of everyday life, notwithstanding that the world is changing, life is changing, and it seems to be that much more pressing on us, if not oppressing. And now that we have technologies that allow us to see ourselves on screen, the brain in operation, we're able to use biofeedback techniques to alter and change the way we think and feel at will. But more about that shortly. What is a habit? So I consulted Professor Google, who's my great master of words and information, and he informed me that it's a settled or regular tendency or practice, especially one that is hard to give up. Well, if I had read that, I probably would have given up straight away. And as I mentioned last night, for those of you who were at the opening, we lay down our software program of habits. And by repeating ourselves over and over again, the result is that we ingrain the groove of the mind. Take, for example, a common emotion, an emotion which we describe as anger. Now, I know that this doesn't apply to anyone in this audience, but out there are such people, often in the strange position of behind a wheel driving a car. Did you know that Judaism instructs us through the Shulchan Aruch that we're not allowed to express anger under any circumstances whatsoever, without exception, full stop? And as soon as I say that, my audience immediately becomes angry with me. How ridiculous of you to even suggest that. Do you not realize that psychology instructs us that it's a need to vent the anger, get it out of our system, or it'll cause untold damage within, splatter us on the walls of our house? At least get hold of a broom and hit the bed 100 times and sublimate it? Of course you're all familiar with that. Except that three generations of psychologists have got it wrong. In the last 10 years, through the field of neuroplasticity, we have concluded that every act of venting anger reinforces it, further lays down that groove of the mind that makes it habitually much more likely. So I think it's rather imperative that we actually alter who we are in order to create a much better society and a much better world. Let's expand on neuroplasticity. What we now have learned is that every time a thought enters our mind, what we're really doing is habitually following pathways between nerve end fibers along a highway of neurotransmitters. And when we think again, because we're basically lazy, so we tend to think the same things over and over again, especially 3 o'clock in the morning when we wake up and ruminate. And of course, in passing, we walk over to the kitchen, open the fridge, and start eating and put on weight in passing. Why is it that that happens almost on cue? And if it's not the 3 o'clock episode, it's other thoughts that tend to assail us. And that is because we haven't learned to undo that particular pathway and be more creative and follow a different route in the mind. Today, that is possible because we can witness your brain's operations on a screen and therefore recognize through scanning techniques what is your default habitual pathway. Therefore, the new science allows us to change in a very profound manner. And I'm not going to go now into the discussion of the technology of how the transmitters move across the synapses, but let me assure you that we have a much better reading of this than we had even 10 years ago. And indeed, the psychological advice of venting it certainly runs counter to what you want to achieve in your life. So, I want to give you a bit of incentive. What you see on screen there is a cell of your body. A green one. Not that your cells are green, but I just happen to like the color green. And on the surface of the cell, you'll find these orange things called receptors. Now, receptors act like giant advertising billboards. They're advertising for guests, Shabbos guests. They love to have guests at their table within the cell, but only particular kind of guests. Guests that are called ligands, that flow freely in the bloodstream. Now, when a ligand finds its way at the doorway of a receptor, the appropriate receptor, the right address, kisses the mezuzah and is given entry, then when it enters, it helps the manufacturing process of the cell to be optimal. We have found people who engage habitually in negative emotions and negative thoughts make it very difficult for the appropriate ligand to find its way to the appropriate cell and enter. The result is what you and I would call illness, depending on the weakness of the body, where that illness manifests itself. And I only raise this to provide you with some incentive to do something about negative thoughts and negative emotions, because they really very acutely affect us. Not only because we'd like to live qualitative lives and longer lives, but it's an absolute mitzvah to maintain health and wellness. The mitzvah of integrity of the body is no different and no less than the mitzvah of kashrus, Shabbos, Yom Kippur, or anything else. And therefore I find it anomalous that so many even frum people today are very, very specific and careful about other mitzvahs, but not about the health of their body, whether that be in terms of fitness or be in terms of what we're talking today, the way we think and the way we feel. So, who are we? Let's go to tin tacks. You and I are a duality. We're made up of two component parts. One part is called the machinery. The machinery of the body is the body itself. Take the eye. The eye sees. I think it's rather remarkable that when a person dies, 5 seconds after they die, where the eye's physiology has not yet altered, the person can no longer see. And you'll say, Laibl, that's obvious, they're dead. But what does it mean, dead? It means that there must be another dynamic taking place within the body, and that's the energy flow, which we call neshama colloquially. When that energy flow flows through the appropriate machinery, we experience a consciousness. Through the eye, we experience the consciousness of sight. Sight means the neshama flowing through the physiology of the body, that part of the body called eye. Hearing is the human experience of the neshama flowing through the physiology of the ear. Now to our subject matter, brain, likewise. Brain may well be a complex piece of machinery, but nevertheless it is but machinery. And therefore, as the neshama flows through the brain, we have a phenomenon we experience as mind or intelligence or intellect. English has so many words. In Hebrew, seichel. When the neshama flows through the heart, the result is an experience called emotions. So we see that that duality appears in the end construct of our experience. I'm showing you here on screen a Kabbalistic model of the nature of mind and the nature of emotion. And you'll see that it's something much more sophisticated than what we have evolved in Western or Eastern psychology as well. What you have here, I wonder if I have a pointer. I don't. Okay, what we have here is 4 planes of existence. You and I, right now, in this lecture room number 2, are living in the realm at the bottom there called Asiya. The realm of Asiya is characterized by time and space. It's our normative circumstance. It's where our existential meaning in life evolves. But you and I also exist at the very same time, contemporaneously, in the realm above it, Yetzirah. Yetzirah has no time, no space. Can you conceive of that? No. However, the world of Beriah above it makes Yetzirah look concrete, and the realm of Atzilus makes Beriah look absolutely material. And yet, you and I exist in all of these realms. As our neshama flows down from the Ein Sof, the Hebrew of Ein Sof translates as without end or infinity or a metaphor for God, creator. It flows through these 4 realms. And in each of these realms, it adopts some of the characteristics of the realm. And each one of us has variation of characteristics leading to different personalities based on where our soul tends to station itself a little longer along its journey down to Asiya. 3 of these component energy parts of the neshama, called Chochmah, Bina, and Da'at, become mind. The other 7, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus, become an expression of emotions. So take emotions, 7 emotions. Therefore, a Hasidic psychologist would have at his or her fingertips a template of not just 7 emotions, but because each is ultimately made up of each other, 49 emotions. That's a very, very sophisticated instrument to analyze and understand your client. So that just gives us a little bit of a sense that mind and emotion is our personality located within the neshama and expressed through our individualized clothing called body. And since God has given us each a different item of clothing, That's another variable why everyone in this room is distinctly individual and different from each other. So that's the nature of the person. Now let's have a look at what consciousness is. It's a big word. Let me build it up, though. Let me begin with mind. So definition, mind is the human experience of the neshama flowing through the physiology of the brain. Emotion is the human experience of the neshama flowing through the physiology of the heart. Consciousness, a word that's much bandied around, and even in psychology textbooks, definitions are mutually exclusive. In our teachings, physiology, the consciousness is the human experience of the soul flowing through all organs, limbs, and that total experience is called consciousness. So now we have a common language that you and I can perhaps talk through the next stage of the presentation. We know through research, examples, Professor Sonia Lyubomirsky, Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, and others, that who we are is a product of, well, 50% they claim is set point, which means genetically set, your genes. Another 10% is your environment, the circumstances of your life, and they do allow for 40% to be intentional activity, your choice. The only way that Judaism varies from their conclusion is that we claim that you have 100% free choice, notwithstanding your genetic makeup, and notwithstanding your environmental processing, and notwithstanding your formative childhood experience. That you can exercise free choice. And now our topic. You need to overcome the default of habit that you have acquired. Now, the average age in the audience is about 35. Therefore, you've had 35 years of life experience, and probably lazily so. In other words, repeating over and over again similar thought patterns. In other ways, the way you interpret adversity, the way you interpret people's behavior, and the resultant emotion flows of either attraction or otherwise. And what we want to suggest is that free choice allows you to change all that. You don't have to respond in the same way, but number one, you have to identify the things you don't like about yourself. Not many people do that. Sometimes that's a little bit painful or a little bit frightening, and usually the way people righteously indignate and justify themselves is with the very, very profound words, "But I was just born that way." No, you were born with the particular nisayon, test, to change, not to stay. And because of your previous lifetime, you have been reincarnated with this set of characteristics, genes, parents, community, because that is your beginning point of the journey called change, which we call life. If I were to talk in terms of now the word mindfulness, which is the subject matter, I would probably identify it, not totally, but to a large extent, with the Hebrew word kavanah. The word kavanah usually is translated as intention. But what indeed is intention? Intention means the mind's focus of all the variables into a narrow beam that concludes with this interpretation. So, they're yelling at me. They're screaming at me. They happen to be my child. How dare they? What chutzpah. After all the years that I put in and all the sacrifice, and they act to me like that, without any respect, derech eretz and the like. What's that all about? That is a very common groove of the mind which makes you a victim in the dynamic of the moment. A victim, because you'll repeat it over and over again. Thinking like that or speaking like that will not help the child and will not help you. You'll feel worse afterwards, and the child will feel even more disconnected from you, whether the child is 5 years of age or 35 years of age. No different. So what do we need to do? We have to create a flexibility of reinterpretation. Mindfulness provides us with the capacity to create a level playing field. It means we allow ourselves to remain calm, create a certain momentary vacuum, and in so doing, practice moach shalit al halev, that the mind, which provides the compass bearing, will then provide that compass bearing to our emotions, the heart, and our feelings will then flow wisely, intelligently, or as Western thought has caught up with Jewish teachings, emotional intelligence. All that has to happen in the space of maybe an instant. It won't happen in a state of instancy unless we practice. It's not unlike music. You want to play the piano? Well, guess what? Even if you study 2 years of theory, the fingers will still not conform to your brain. You need to practice, practice, practice. And then, after practicing that piece of Beethoven, Schubert, Mozart, Brahms, whatever might be the case, you practice it enough, the fingers instantly respond to the reading of the mind, and you are in the flow. No different in interpersonal behavior. No different in terms of we being wise and appropriate in the moment. You have to practice for that so it happens. So the child or the person is yelling and screaming at you. What would be a wiser response? Instead of the victim mentality of egotism, how dare you speak to me like that? Why not the chesed approach? They're yelling and screaming. That means they're in pain, whether physical pain or emotional pain. What can I do to assist them? Have a look. What we've done just there is totally reverse the direction of consciousness through mindfulness. Instead of immediately becoming defensive because of insecurity, guilt, or other factors, and therefore it's all about me, 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 what you've done is change the direction, and it's about the flow outwards, not the flow inwards. We care about the other. We strategize what's the right words of response. Maybe silence is the best approach. So it depends on the circumstance. That's what I'm talking about, the use of mindfulness as being here now, which is the way that John Kabat-Zinn nominated it when he drew from actually Eastern approach of Buddhism to evolve this as a non-theistic pathway of therapy. And by living deeply in the now, and as I say, bringing all your 5 senses into play to read the situation that much more profoundly, coupled with the approach which is the other rather than you, you can respond in a way which creates progress, change, both in the other and in oneself. That is the promise. But like all things, it requires what we call in Hasidus avoda, work, hard work and repetitive practice. How long? You do not have to go to India, to a cave for 7 years in order to achieve this. But yes, you do need a methodology and practice for a month or two, no more. So imagine an investment of a month or two in order to create that kind of propriety that will not only make your life much happier, much more fulfilling, but in so doing, profoundly affect all the ones that you really care about and love, let alone the stranger as well. So the main thing is to keep the main thing, as I said last night. And the main thing is, as I said last night, tracht gut und wird sein gut. Think positive and the outcomes will be positive. Very nice, but how do you train to become positive? So I'm giving you some hints about that. Let me share with you a particular experiment, nice piece of research that took at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which I've called Willy Wonka and the MIT Rat's Chocolate Factory. And let me explain to you what they did. It was very clever what they did. They constructed a very long plastic tunnel, something like from the stage here to the end of the room over there. And they had it as a T intersection at the end, so that you could either turn right or left at the end of the tunnel. Then they got some rats, and they operated on the rats, implanting a mechanism where they could monitor the brain of the rat. And then what they did was put a piece of chocolate at the end of the T intersection on one of the sides. And then they let the first rat go into the tunnel. And they observed the rat. And this was the rat's behavior. It sort of wandered and meandered into the tunnel, sniffing casually, scratching the sides, taking its time, an inordinate amount of time, to reach the end, sniffs again, sniffs the chocolate, goes over to the chocolate and gets its reward. Second rat, identical behavior. And those series of rats all display the same behavior. Then they took the same rats and repeated. Not very different. But by the 100th time that the same rat was going along that tunnel, it no longer was casual, it was no longer sniffing, it was no longer scratching, it was rushing to the end and getting the chocolate straight away. So far, no chidushim. Everyone here would say, what a waste of time in this experiment. I could have told you that before you started. But here is the difference. In the brain of the rat, things were happening totally unpredictable, unexpected. As the rat was first sauntering up casually, the brain was working overtime, furiously, although the behavior belied the opposite. At the end, when it was rushing 1, 2, 3 and getting the chocolate, the brain was hardly working. Intuitively, you would have said the opposite. What was happening? The brain had become habituated. And as a consequence of that, it didn't have to use brain power at all. And you and I, likewise, become habituated and don't use brain power in the normative, everyday circumstances of life. And that's why we're so predictable. We can predict exactly how we behave under adversity, under stress, under any kind of circumstance that we find uncomfortable. And that's what we want to change. We want to make sure that the brain is working furiously, mindfully, in the very first moment, reinterpreting the data and thereby setting down a new pathway within the brain which we have adjudged to be a better response to this situation. So I have here in words what I just said, if you want to just take a quick look. The part of the brain where our habits are stored is a thing called the basal ganglia. And it's where all our less than conscious activities stem from. It's somewhere right at the base of the brain as such. Now, having established that, it's also true that some habits can be useful. So you have to be wise in choosing which habits to retain and which not. Do you remember when you first learned to drive and the first occasion that you backed out of your garage? You were very, very mindful. So mindful that it took you maybe up to 10 minutes to back out of the garage. The key has to be put in, if those days we used keys. Then you had to adjust the mirror, side mirror, head mirror. You had to make sure that the garbage tin was not in the way in the back. Please make sure that the garage door is open. Check the line of the traffic. And you were oh so careful. And please, Dovey, stop fiddling out there. It's making me nervous as I'm backing out of the garage. And all that was happening. Today, you back out of the garage, 1, 2, 3, no problem. Because you have actually taken that habit, put it down into your basal ganglia, and as a consequence, it serves you very well. Because you really have so many things in life that you don't need to be mindful about. And therefore, wisdom, chokhmah, is needed to be a discriminator in order for you to make life decisions. What should I work on? What is it that I don't want to be habitual? I don't want to be habitual with my grandchildren. They're growing and evolving, and each day presents a new facet. How can I recognize that? Change my choice of words, interpret what they're doing, and in so doing, being a wise grandparent. So these things are important to think in terms about of choice, of where you want to change and where you don't want to change. Now, some of the very well-known companies are very familiar with both mindfulness and habit. McDonald's happens to be one of them. Now, I know that you don't eat at McDonald's, but a lot of people do. So let me share with you some of the habits. McDonald's is a very clever organization. It knows full well that the architecture of each place should look identical, be rather colorful, be well positioned in height to be seen from the distance so that the eye can catch it. It knows full well that it has to have a training program to provide scripts for its employees, and that these scripts are laden with suggestive, emotive, and experiential terminologies. The food itself is very clever. It's engineered to deliver an immediate reward. The fries are designed to disintegrate exactly on cue as they hit the tongue, providing you with that hit of salt and fat, which lights up the pleasure centers of the brain immediately. All this can be seen on screen today. So they know that they can get you and habituate you, and we may use the word addictive. I don't want to discuss addiction now, but of course there's a thing called food addiction. But even if it's not addictive, it's certainly habit, and not a very good health habit at all. Exactly the contrary. So, what that does mean is that someone who has become habituated and they're driving along and they see that big McDonald's sign, immediately the brain registers because they have a recollection of the pleasure centers being lit up, and the primary motivation of human endeavor is oneg, pleasure, and therefore it's a very powerful motivator, and inevitably you give yourself every single reason why you should go in that direction. And then you have the reinforcement of the employee, and then you have it, the pleasure center of the actual food hitting the tongue, etc. Or sitting by the TV and eating out of those stupid packets mindlessly, habitually, every single time. You know what I'm talking about. So, habit is made up of 3 elements. The cue, that big M for McDonald's, for example. The routine, I'm going to drive into there because it's really quick, it's very easy. I'm actually going to save my wife so much work, and you rationalize to yourself, and then, of course, you have the reward, because the reward is highly pleasureful for those who find pleasure in that. Okay, so do we have any program that we can actually change and become more mindful in context of this kind of habit that we've ingrained in the mind as such? And the answer is absolutely yes. I'm not going to do it with you now, but the elements might well be something like this. I'll ask you to keep a diary, and I'll ask you to note over a period of 3-4 weeks, where are you when your habit seems to begin to hit you? What time in the day is it? Because body rhythms play a very significant role in context of this, as does your glycemic index, as does your sugar rating and all the other things. What are you feeling at the time? Very often habits take on the life of their own when emotions are down. People, who's around you, because very often it's people that cause you to enter into that habitual pattern. And then the activity. What is it that you're actually doing? So that's what we might do by way of a program one day perhaps, or you'll do it yourself. I'm going to introduce you now to what I think is the most liberating proposition on how to have an ambience of mindfulness around you, covering every exigency of your life, every aspect of your life, every circumstance of your life. And that's emunah and bitachon, as I began to mention last night. I defined emunah and bitachon the way that my teacher, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, did. He said, emunah is the belief that everything that has ever occurred to you is for your current good. Bitachon is the belief that the challenge you face now will have a positive outcome. Noch einmal. Emunah goes from the past to the present. Whatever's ever happened to you is for your current good. Bitachon goes from the present to the future. The challenge you face now will have a positive outcome. These are axiomatic propositions. I'm asking you to assume these as belief. I cannot prove them to you, but neither can you disprove them to me. So we're on equal ground. Except I know that those people I've trained to adopt a mindful posture of emunah and bitachon lead far happier lives, far more fulfilling lives, and far healthier lives without the need of stress, worry, and anxiety. And that's a big one. And I repeat again, you can't disprove this proposition, nor can I prove it. But there's some very wonderful outcomes. So when things happen to you that you need to respond, if you can have an ambience of this particular double-edged weapon that actually covers the circumstance, then under those circumstances, what you have is the possibility of responding wisely. So that's the biggest layer. The biggest layer is your consciousness of emunah and bitachon in every aspect of life. The next layer is practicing the mindfulness by looking at those particular habitual processes that you want to undo. Next, to follow exercises, primarily meditative exercises, which I'll explain in my next session, in order to undo them, to lay down a new pathway within the brain that becomes the new norm. I'm going to close with the example I gave last night, because I'm not sure how many of you were all there last night, but it was a very dramatic one in the field of physiotherapy. And I mentioned that when people have strokes, God forbid, lo aleinu, and the stroke may disable an arm or a leg, the traditional therapeutic model required us to try to allow the good arm and the good leg to compensate so that life's activities could once again normalize to some extent. These days, we do something very different. We strap up their good arm, we strap up their good leg, so they can't utilize that which they can use, and ask them to exercise ratzon, willpower, to move the arm and the leg, which they can't, which seems ridiculous at first. But what is a stroke? A stroke means that a certain, if you will, pathway in the brain has been broken. We now know through neuroplasticity that you can actually build a new pathway in the brain as an act of will. And we have found, therefore, there's a very often where it's possible, an accelerated rate of therapy under this particular model, that they regain the use of that arm or that leg much more quickly. Isn't that amazing? And that particular aspect of life can be applied to everything. So I want to encourage you. You are able to change anything you want in life. Don't let anyone say to you, you can't. You were born that way. That's the way I am. I'm now 65. How can I? Every single person has got freedom. Read Viktor Frankl. He tells you that even in the most adverse circumstances of concentration camps, he had the freedom of choice of interpreting his circumstances. So with that, I'd like to leave you with that promise. For those of you who would like to have some follow-through, because I don't live in South Africa, feel free to visit me at my centre, Spirit Grow in Melbourne, when you've passed through. It's a personal growth centre. But I've left in the back here 14 CDs of growth and development. It was on screen before, but it's no longer on screen. Okay, but those 14 CDs are in one USB. So all you need to do is take that one USB, and there's a snap scan system if you'd like to purchase that, and you can load it onto your computer. So thank you very much for spending a little time with me. I look forward to meeting you and speaking with you throughout Sinai Indaba, and I want to wish you a good life.